I'm going to give you a very quick run through this document, which you should have received, and I'd urge you afterwards to have a look at that. My background, for the last 30 years, I've worked on mobility, infrastructure, urban development projects around the world. So I have some insight. I was involved long before they were smart, well before they were future. They just were cities when I started. The purpose of the report is really to look at whether smart approaches offer us new ways to tackle the environmental challenges in our cities. And really, will a determination to tackle these challenges actually stimulate new smart thinking itself? So we have all these new technological tools. How can we put those to best effect? The task force itself was put together by the EiC and had a broad range of thought leaders from across a broad spectrum, including consultants, technology providers, academics, and local authorities. And really was, for me, a very nice group to chair because of the diversity of thoughts and inputs. First thing we had to do, though, was to try and come up with a definition for our task force that really limited it down, because to address smart cities overall is far too big a subject for a task force that sat for four months or so. So what we really did was to come up with this definition, which was that smart city initiatives and applications are those which are based upon using the power of network devices, both those that are centrally controlled and those that are under the control of the individuals. And really that big data was at the heart of potentially improving the functioning and capability of our cities. And that's really the step change we were looking at. Does big data, access to big data, really create a step change in the way that we look at cities? We started by having a look at the environmental challenges in the major cities, and we looked at 4 categories. And the observant amongst you will see there are only 3 when you look at this diagram, and I'll come back to this, but you'll see in the report and the objective basis on which we looked at the assessment is there. But the overriding message from when we looked at air quality, recycling, carbon, was that although cities were doing some great things, the battle was far from won, and actually we were starting to level off in terms of the impact that we were having. And the 4th topic, challenge that we looked at was water. And that really highlighted another issue altogether, which is that water in this country is looked at on a catchment basis, not by cities. So actually even analysing cities in terms of water is quite difficult and quite complicated. So if we can't even see it, how we're performing, certainly that's a challenge to how we can make best effect. We then started to look at ways in which we felt that smart technology solutions, a smart approach, could really help in terms of challenges and the environmental challenges in particular. We looked at how we could increase our understanding of the challenges, and smart technology provides a great basis for that. It gives access to data in a way that we just couldn't even dream about when I started working on cities. It allows us to raise awareness. We can get the message to people, to the public in general, to decision makers in a way, again, that we couldn't have anticipated. We can identify efficiency improvements which can benefit the environment, and most importantly, we can start to look at real-time matching between supply and demand, which has always been something that has been spoken about, but actually hasn't been implemented very readily. And we can give citizens greater environmental influence. We talked about the whole point of giving some of the decision-making the need to buy into environmental challenges back to the public so it raises itself. But what we did find was, despite the potential that smart technologies provided and the step changes that have occurred, the impact's been not as significant as we'd like. And you can argue about where it sits, but certainly the impact is more limited than we'd like. It's not meant that environmental challenges have been put at the forefront of smart initiatives. Very often it's a byproduct. Non-smart solutions are still sometimes more relevant and mustn't be ignored in the rush towards the new technology. Funders won't invest quite often without the evidence of that impact being direct and being linked to that funding. So environmental challenges often present a particular challenge in that respect. So what we saw is that there's limited impact of smart solutions on those environmental challenges at the moment. And what impact there is is coming out of some great pilots, but is almost a byproduct of what's being done. So there's much more scope. And unusually for a Smart Cities Task Force, we came to the conclusion that smart is not always the right answer. So it's important, again, that you don't see it as one or the other. It's a menu. Smart is not always effective at cutting out pollution at source, of course. Technology can be applied to that, but the smart data doesn't necessarily help with that. Efficient movement in dense space requires appropriate physical infrastructure. So there's a need to match the smart technology solutions with the infrastructure. And we feel it's very important as a task force that we consider the two. It's a blending of the two. We need the right infrastructure with the right solutions. And so the conclusions, and I'll leave you in more leisure, look at the report itself that we've produced, which is intended to kickstart the debate, really. The smart city concept is new. The environmental aspects of that even more so. We collectively need to get our head around that. And I really like John Cridland's 2 buckets. We see smart solutions definitely in that second bucket. It has to be non-politicised. We need hard evidence of how the impact of smart technology is actually implemented, what works, building on what Mark said about the C40 cities. What works? How can it work? What conditions need to make it work? And certainly, finally, how the markets may develop faster and costs can come down quicker if we move away from pilots and more towards standardisation. And we really feel as a task force, now is the time to step up the implementation of standardisation for smart technology approaches and move beyond those. But also to allow smaller scale rollouts when the whole city-wide approach may not be appropriate. And what we've seen is that neighbourhood level is an extremely effective way in order to implement some of that work. So that is just a very quick run through the work. I'd like to thank the rest of the task force and EiC for the work we've done, and hopefully that lays the ground now for a discussion session. Thank you.
As we did with this morning's panel session, there are 3 panellists who the room hasn't been introduced to. So maybe if we could start with Owain Jones of Cross River Partnership, if you could just give us a couple of brief minutes on, well, again, the big question, why are you here?
Good morning. I work for Cross River Partnership. It's a public-private partnership focused on central London. Our board members are 7 central London local authorities that represent the historic and economic heart of the city, and also 15 business improvement districts, which represent approximately 3,000 businesses in central London, from corporates to SMEs. Cross River Partnership's USP is kind of twofold. Essentially, we work on a sub-regional basis on issues which boroughs cannot necessarily address on their own, including transport and air quality, to name but 2. And also that we are very successful in levering funding from Europe to promote a number of our projects. I'll just say a little bit about 4 of the areas of work that we're involved with, which I think is relevant to both what Jason has said and Mark previously. So the first of those is the freight electric vehicles in urban Europe, which is partners 8 European cities, of which London is the lead partner. And this is to trial freight electric vehicles in Lisbon, in Madrid, in Milan, in Stockholm, and as I say, London. I won't list all of the partners. That's 120 vehicles across those cities. But it isn't just purely focused on trialling and demonstrating the utility of freight electric vehicles, but also looking at charging infrastructure, consolidation centres, and use of integrated logistics ICT systems, and the leasing and procurement options and arrangements. And this will lead to the publication of a white paper in a few years from now, which will aim to roll out some of the demonstrator projects if proved successful, and also seek to influence European-level policymakers, government, local authorities and logistics operators. So that's one of the 4 projects which Cross River Partnership involved with. The second is last mile logistics, which I'll summarise much more briefly. That involves 11 partners in the UK, Netherlands, Germany, France, Ireland, Belgium and Luxembourg. And it's promoting last mile solutions as part of the supply chain in planning freight logistics journeys. There are demonstrator projects are part of that programme. In London, that's based around the Consolidation Centre based in Enfield, which involves Camden Local Authority, Waltham Forest, and DHL as the private sector provider. Cross River Partnership, in particular, in that project, are focusing on the regulatory barriers and opportunities, and we're looking at 11 policy areas around consolidation, delivery servicing plans, intelligent management systems, time deliveries, etc. So that's the second of the projects. The other two are our Clean Air Better Business programme, which is funded through the Mayor's Air Quality Fund. That's £330,000 of public sector money provided by TfL, which has been matched by £270,000 from our business improvement district partners. And that's to trial a suite of measures focused on the taxi and freight industry, which make disproportionate contribution to poor air quality in the centre of London. And just a flavour of what that menu involves. So a large part of it is about business engagement, about creating awareness and building capacity. But it's also very practical in terms of looking at delivery servicing plans and developing guides as to what kind of is a best in practice delivery servicing plan. Also looking at promoting zero and low emissions vehicles, and either doing that through a brochure or through a portal which enables users who want to buy in whether it's catering services or office supplies, that they can choose a zero low emissions vehicle provider for that service. The last of the project is Greening the Bids, which has been catalysed by money from the Drain London Fund, originally provided by DEFRA but administered by the GLA. And that is supporting, again, our business improvement district partners to install green infrastructure projects, so rain gardens, roof gardens, green walls. Probably one of the best examples is the green wall on the side of the Rubens Hotel in Victoria. I don't know if any of you have seen that. It's one of the biggest green walls in Europe. Has a very innovative irrigation system which uses rainwater. Obviously, these aren't just for aesthetic purposes, but they do have pollution capture properties of the plants which are selected. And over the last 3 or 4 years, that money has catalysed 15 green infrastructure audits within business improvement district areas where they've been able to assess their existing assets and opportunities for the installation of new assets. And that has been then backed up with money to catalyse private sector investment to deliver projects on the ground, including the one that I've just mentioned. That's probably enough.
Thank you very much. And Neill Pennell, Land Securities.
I work for Land Securities. We are the UK's largest quoted property company. We've got a portfolio that's valued around £13 billion. It's mainly invested in central London in commercial office space and shops. Outside of London, other towns and cities across the UK, it's retail-led development and retail and leisure parks. So we've got obviously a significant element of built environment. I think we saw on the slides the importance that the built environment will play in terms of reducing pollution and emissions in cities and towns across the world, and our focus is UK-wide. So what have we been doing about that? Our intention is to develop sustainable buildings. Sustainable buildings are good for us as a business in terms of our investment holdings as we move forward. We look in terms of new design opportunities, what we can do in terms of trialling new technologies. For example, we've done a lot of work with ground source energy systems. We're installing, or just have recently installed, the first stationary fuel cell in the square mile in the city in our tower building in 20 Fenchurch Street. We've put green walls into buildings. We've looked at applying a whole series of sustainable measures across our developments and our designs, and we brief our design teams to achieve the best possible outcomes in that process. But I think it's recognising the importance of all those things coming together and working alongside all the other measures in a city. We're reliant on transport nodes to bring people to and from our buildings. We need to make sure that they are low impact in terms of the way they work. And we've seen a tremendous change, particularly in London, in terms of people cycling to work. So we're not building car spaces under our buildings anymore. We're building cycle stores and changing rooms and showers, which is a significant change that's happened very rapidly. So understanding what the drivers are and how to respond to that with the built environment as we go forward, understanding where regulation is going and trying to keep ahead of that is important to us to ensure the properties that we build and maintain, own, operate and manage for the people that are our customers are actually ahead of the game and delivering the right outcomes for a sustainable portfolio.
Fascinating stuff. So you're actually now having to build showers in office blocks and cycling storage in the way that even 4 or 5 years ago you wouldn't have done?
No, it's pretty much left to the occupiers to maybe put in a few showers. Traditionally, if you go back a decade, and probably you rarely saw a cycle used to go to an office building. Completely changed now. We're already designing for up to at least 10% of the population of any office building coming in to work on cycles. You need to provide good facilities to enable people to do that, because obviously they need to freshen up for the work day ahead. So the good facilities that go with that are important. So you have to understand that has an impact on the way you design and operate buildings and the offer in terms of a customer service, if you like, that we need to be able to deliver to make our buildings attractive for people to be in and to support the businesses that are in those locations.
Finally, Rodney Turtle, what's your take on these myriad points?
Schneider is a very large multinational company operating in the electricity and energy efficiency space. We have 150,000 employees and probably operate in most countries of the world. I think we've heard today that the case for smart cities is well made. Just some statistics that we use in Schneider. Cities represent 80% of our carbon emissions, 75% of our energy consumption. Cities represent 50% of the Earth's population, but yet only 2% of the Earth's surface. But they're growing, and they're growing very strongly. They are global growth engines, and they need to deliver better outcomes for the citizens and also to do their bit to make sure we don't suffer catastrophic climate change. I have 3 messages that are firmly rooted in Schneider Electric's approach to this issue. The first is, no one company has the resources or the technology or the capabilities to deliver a complete smart city. For example, we worked heavily on the city of Barcelona. You're having to deal with multiple legacy systems, the emergency services, all are different systems, the transport system, the mass transit system, traffic management, all different. You need to be able to aggregate the data so that you can analyze it, come up with meaningful pictures of what's happening, and then come up with some projects. Second, the concept is scalable to other sizes and areas. We heard that already. We do have the possibility of smart districts, smart zones, and perhaps smart campuses. For example, it may be much easier for a UK campus university to implement a smart city type approach to deliver better outcomes than it is for a city in the UK, particularly given the complexity of how local government is organised here. Third, cities, smart cities, it doesn't necessarily mean high tech. It can just mean smarter. For example, we did, in partnership with a leading charity in Brazil in the Amazon rainforest, 2 small projects where in these villages they were using diesel generators which provided 4 hours of electricity per day. We implemented solar generation with battery backup, and we have the amount of diesel they used and also delivered electrical energy for 24 hours a day. So, in conclusion, no one company can do it all. We can scale the concept. Third, smart doesn't need to mean high tech. But what we do need is clear leadership. Someone needs to define a vision. That doesn't mean we need a long-term roadmap, but we need a vision and we need some practical, concrete first steps so that we can deliver outcomes.
Chris Fry from Temple Group. Really coming back to a point that Matthew made in his opening presentation around the catapults and industrial policy. So we have one of the catapults is the Future Cities catapult. We have a range of others, including transport systems, which is highly relevant to this agenda, also satellite applications and so on. Now, these catapults are quietly going about their business, and in some cases have only been going for a few months or less than a year. Just wondering what the panel would suggest that the catapult should be doing to play a role to catalyse this whole agenda around the environmental benefit of smart cities.
Mark, how should this sit in infrastructure policy, and what should those catapults be doing more aggressively, perhaps?
Well, one of the vagaries of my job is I actually spend very little time in Britain these days. So I may be not the best person to comment, although from what I've seen of what the catapults are doing, it seems to be the right starting point, which is if you're really going to move to a model of what we understand as a smart city. It's quite a change from the way that governments are set up at the moment. So in the simplest terms, I think it's getting a systems thinking approach in government, whereas for most of us, we know quite often we're working in silos in departments. So I think that actually that very simple thing of giving local authorities the funding to enable them to bring their different data systems together so that you can get a comprehensive map of what's happening in the city and be able to run services in a more efficient way is the right starting point. I'm afraid I don't think I'm qualified to be any more specific, as I'm not so involved with them. I'm sure other panel members know a lot more than I do.
I think the catapults are a really positive step forward. I think they also demonstrate, in some extent, one of the complications of this. Actually, probably two complications. Firstly, is the environmental benefits or environmental outcomes of those catapults initiatives are not always at the forefront. In some senses, they're not even well defined at the forefront. And I think that's a shame. I think they should be. I think any initiative of this nature, the environmental outcomes need to form part of the overall expectations. And whilst they may be indirect to some extent, they need to be held and maintained and preserved. And if not delivered on, that should also be part of the assessment of the success or otherwise. The second point I would say is it also demonstrates one of the areas that we feel that there's plenty of scope to examine, which is the interconnection. Mark just spoke about systems approach. I think the interconnection between those different catapult initiatives and the ability to maximize those, so not just to link them, but to actually make the most of those linkages. That for me is an area where I feel there's substantive opportunities. So whilst each of the catapults I think are progressing early days, but they're progressing quite well in terms of the way they're being brought together, are we really making maximum opportunity of the connectivity between them? And I'm not sure we are yet.
Is there a challenge here with the complexity of the cities and the smart cities debate? I mean, with the catapults, we understand what the offshore wind one does. We understand what the low carbon transport one does. And when you say future cities, as a journalist, it's quite difficult to even define that and explain what that is to people. And smart cities likewise. I mean, is there a definition problem here?
I think there is. I think there's definitely a public lack of understanding as to it, and certainly future cities, I think, in some ways alienates a lot of existing city dwellers. They believe it's not something that relates to them. It's something that relates to something else that's new and coming and doesn't relate to the cities they live in. Whereas actually, I think smart cities is very much about that. I think the applications in existing cities are far more numerous than they are for new build, and albeit new build will be an important component, it's getting those technological solutions, those linkages together in our existing cities where I think the maximum benefits can be derived.
I think we've probably oversold the vision and the big picture, whereas to me the most important thing is to actually do something practical to deliver some better outcomes for the environment, for citizens. So sell perhaps more the first steps rather than just the vision. I think the vision might be oversold and the actual first implementable steps undersold.
My name's Sarah Marriott. I'm from UK Flood Barriers. We're probably, I think, the newest member of EiC. My question I have is, with the buzzword of being about sustainable homes, buildings and now cities, how can a building be sustainable unless flood risk has been properly addressed at the design stage? That's part A. And part B is, does the panel think that regulation needs to be brought in for developers to look at passive technology at the build stage?
Well, I think effectively it is something that you consider when you're looking at a new development or even reinvesting in existing developments. We look at the risk profile of our buildings that we own. We also, when we're approaching a new development, part of the process of going through the environmental impacts that you have on creating that new building is to look at the constraints that you have to work within and the risks that it could be exposed to. So if those risks are too high, it might cause you not to actually go ahead with that particular development, or you put in place measures that will mitigate any issue and protect the building in the future from the risk of flooding. And I think both of those outcomes are possible. Part of the process of going through the planning process, effectively you go through that process and that thought process. Similarly, in terms of the type of technologies to meet the energy efficiency requirements for buildings, it's part of an iterative design process you go through again. There are lots of regulation already in place. Building regulation, Part L, covers the use of energy in buildings. You have to get compliance with that. Actually, in most of the major city locations, the planning authorities require you to go further than what regulation requires. So to actually put together a new design, a new development, you go through a whole process of looking what the best solutions are. And the use of passive technology is part of that, but it may not always be effective for the typology of buildings that you're creating. And what you need to do, in whatever solution you adopt, you need to choose the most efficient outcome that meets the requirement in terms of the delivery of a sustainable building that can be used for its purpose with the minimum environmental impact and the maximum efficiency. And I think all those measures are in place in the design process, the regulation and the planning that you need to get through to actually have agreement to produce a new asset.
Mark, I noticed one of your examples, the oyster beds. I mean, that's technically that's landscape and flood management all in one. I mean, were you seeing more of that type of thinking?
Yeah, I think in general, we're seeing in the C40 cities the focus on adaptation to the inevitable consequences of climate change is shooting up the agenda as the impacts are just being felt in a way that is far above what was projected for the cities. But also, I think, in a sort of more generic, answer the question in a generic way around the role of regulation, I think we have to get back to the fundamentals here, and Nick Stern was exactly right. Climate change is a product of fundamental market failure, and that market failure has to be corrected, which means there is a big role for benign regulation. There is a very important role for government in correcting that market failure, which we shouldn't be afraid of. Interestingly, one of the things I was doing in China last week was a talk at the Stanford Center in Beijing University with the mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, who was very sort of forthright in saying we shouldn't be afraid of good regulation. You know, in his country, in the United States, it's difficult as a politician to stand up and say we need more regulation, we need stronger government. But actually, good regulation delivers for the market. Good regulation delivers for business. And I think what you're talking about is exactly the right kind of example.
While we're touching on flood risk, we had a story last week where one of my journalists wrote a story about 1 in 100-year flood risk. And somebody pointed out, which I'd never thought of it in this way before, that's a 10% risk every decade, which is a way of framing it that suddenly makes you think, actually, that's quite a high risk. 1 in 100 years sounds like it will never happen, 10% every decade. And of course, 1 in 100 year is now coming a lot more frequently. It's a topic we're all going to hear a lot more about this winter, particularly if it rains. The gentleman here has his hand up in the front.
Is there a sort of, a number, a population density or something at which cities cease to function, grind to a halt, and everything goes pear-shaped? And then, encouraging people to say, London, please stop, find somewhere else.
There is a point when the infrastructure's not up to scratch, that's certainly for sure. Maybe the panel would like to share their commuter horror stories. I've certainly got a few that I could bore you with for hours, but...
I live in Barnes, West London, so it's very nice, but it's in a bend in the Thames, and it's got a railway line and a common to the south. So on Monday morning, I got up, and suddenly I found the bus stop was totally deserted, and there's no traffic on Castle Now, which is the major road going across Hammersmith Bridge. So the sewer had collapsed, and the road was closed. I'm afraid it's open one way now, so my commute was about 15 minutes longer. But it's still a nice place to live.
I think that the crux of the question of whether there is a tipping point, whether there's a point at which cities don't work, and that argument that we are better at lowering emissions within cities starts to fall down because the infrastructure is not good enough, or simply because the city gets too big. I mean, is there that tipping point? It seems sorry.
I think that cities are inherently sustainable if they have the right infrastructure and the right transport infrastructure. I think those things are absolutely key, and if they are, then you're bringing people close together, the journeys and the transport is minimised, and you can share a lot of services because there is that aggregation of use, and therefore there is a sustainable outcome there for cities. And as I've seen earlier, cities are going to play the major part in determining whether we get control of our environment or whether we don't over the next few decades. So I think it's really important. But I think there are areas that we do need to review, we do need to improve. I think air quality has been picked up, and we've seen how bad it is in some of those Chinese cities. But in cities in the UK, it's bad, and in London, it's particularly bad. And if we're going to make cities good places to live in, that's got to be number one priority for me. I think the infrastructure that we have, a lot of it is old, right across the UK. There needs to be a renewal. There needs to be an investment, a smart thinking into the way we do that, and that those new investments in infrastructure are done in a way where we do them once, not like we see quite often, because there isn't a sort of planning process for that, if you like, that you get a road dug up 10 times to put in 10 supplies when one supply could be put in to serve 10 uses. And it's that sort of thinking that I think has got to change, and infrastructure is a great driver of that. And without good infrastructure, cities can't work.
And Owen, your organisation working on some of those potential solutions to what is a very, very serious challenge, and it's getting worse.
Yeah, I apologise. I don't think I can answer your question. Perhaps Mark's better qualified. I'll mention just a few things. Earlier this year, Transport for London produced its transport emissions roadmap, which is essentially a discussion document, an ideas piece which it seeks to engage local authorities and the private sector around. Some of the top 10 in there, top of the list is the ultra-low emissions zone, which is quite controversial in London, and then tightening of the low emission zone, and then kind of towards the bottom of the end of that list is more about citizen engagement and this concept of low emissions neighbourhoods or zero emissions zones. And I know, because I chair the Central London Sub-Regional Transport Partnership, that local authorities are very engaged in some of these concepts, but they do want to see them work, and they don't want to see them have a negative impact on business or residents. They're obviously very mindful at officer level how their politicians, their political masters will view some of these propositions. But I commend TfL for publishing the document and for seeking to engage people around some of the practical solutions to managing our transport problems and the emissions which come from it. Just two other things very quickly that TfL are engaged in, which are happening in London next year, which is a walking challenge and a cycle challenge. And these are, for very short defined periods, but relevant to the presentation that we saw earlier, is about these are technology-based or enabled solutions where you have a mobile application or web-based application which you can log your journeys over a 2 or 3 week period during the challenge period. And the idea is that you will gather up those people who are already cycling, but also those who are perhaps less likely to cycle, and then you get a legacy once that challenge period finishes. And that's about incentivising behaviour change, and there are rewards for people who participate in this scheme besides those that come towards the top. Now, these are small measures, but it's very interesting to see what impact they can have and how they can incentivise people to behave differently. And I think a mix of these different sort of big ticket items like the ultra low emission zone, and then incentivising people and giving them control over their own neighbourhoods to make changes, offer a menu which could have a positive impact.
Although the point on infrastructure investment is absolutely valid, I think there was a report earlier this year by somebody from LSE who was predicting rather worryingly that in the next 20 years you might have public transport riots within London because the infrastructure is simply not growing fast enough. And as somebody who's just moved from North West London, which was very well served, to South East London and now deals with delayed trains on a daily basis, I can fully see that. You see people getting frustrated and angry because you are crammed on and there isn't enough infrastructure. And while London is very good, there is a need for much further investment and focus on it. We have time for one more quick question. I think the gentleman in the middle there in the grey suit.
David Simons, also from WSP. So Jason, I won't target this at you.
I'm very relieved.
It's a question for Mark, really. So for the leading cities that you've cited, is it top-down leadership that drives this, or is it bottom-up people power?
It's a combination. Certainly we're working with a set of very dynamic and generally fairly visionary leaders. These are mostly the cities that have been most successful are where leaders are willing and able to think about the long term, what the city is going to look like in 20 or 25 years, long after they've left office, and take pretty tough decisions to set the city on a pattern of of development. But it is also noticeable the more successful ones tend to be the ones that have got the strongest partnership with the business community in their city. I think particularly Copenhagen, Stockholm, for example, really strong connection, not just, and in a way where the leaders of the business community are really helping to drive strategic policy direction as well as intervening so that regulations are beneficial to their particular business, for example. So it's a much more collaborative relationship. I think Latin America is the place where one is seeing the greatest sort of show of strength of community organisation to affect policy decision. And particularly Bogota is an example of that. What the mayor of Rio is doing there, where he's moving things at such a pace that it's bound to upset people. You start ripping out a 6-lane highway, then it's going to cause some big problems. But he's got this. It hasn't really caught on yet, but he's got this concept of polis digitocracy, which is an attempt to kind of meld the Greek idea of the polis and democratic institutions with the use of information communication technology. But what he's really sort of, the point that he makes is that if he doesn't embrace technology as a leader, then he's going to get kicked out, because his population are already using smartphones, the internet, social media to communicate and to organise whenever he puts a new bus scheme in place or whatever. So he's embracing it and trying to use that to better engage citizens, and it's leading to a kind of more of a granular level of involvement in design by citizens, which I think is interesting. But I couldn't claim that was a major facet of most city development at the moment. It is, the emphasis is more top down at the moment.
Thank you very much to the entire panel. If you'd thank them in the normal way, that'd be fantastic.